you for tearing yourselves away from coffee. It falls to me to wrap up the first day of the conference. And what we'll do first of all is get a little report back from the 4 thematic sessions that we had, either with slides or without. I'm going to say without, because I chaired one of the sessions and I've not any slides at all. Well, actually, I've one. I'll maybe put it up. But certainly the session, I was in capability gap. I think it was very interesting. I think it was very dynamic. I think we got a lot of exchange with the audience. And I hope we can do that in this final session as well. So short reports back from the 4 thematic sessions. And then a sort of general, what do we think, a state of the nation, a perusal of digital preservation perhaps to wend us on our way. And perhaps gird your loins for the Digital Preservation Awards this evening, if you're going to those. So let me start with capability gap. I chaired that. And we had 5 talks, a mix from the vendor side, from Matthew Addis of Archivum, Dan Gillane of Artifactual, and then 3 from the practitioner side maybe, Jen Mitchum from York, Angela Dappert from British Library, Anna Henry from the Royal Society, and all of us looking at, yes, there is a gap. We all agreed there are a number of gaps. It's highlighted all through the plenary this morning as well. We've spent an awful lot of time and perhaps an awful lot of money in trying to understand how to do digital preservation. Why are we not doing it better? And actually, we didn't come to an answer, unfortunately. We did discuss a number of things. And if I can project, I'll give you the list of questions we finished on. So we started with the talks, and then we threw it open to the audience. I don't know if my friend up in the booth there can change. There we go. We finished up with a set of questions, we threw it open. And we had a good discussion around many of these things. The quote at the top there is not mine. That's a wonderfully provocative quote from Paul Wheatley of the Digital Preservation Coalition at the PARSIG conference earlier this year. But we talked around these and, like I say, didn't come to strong conclusions. And the one we didn't discuss too much is perhaps the elephant in the room on costs. Something that was, I think, quite clear is, in terms of next steps, getting a handle on costs, but not alone, costs with benefits and the value of doing this stuff properly, and the risk management that we all need to do and to get better at. That was really the sense of, if I can sum the session up in one line, it was, let's get a better understanding of costs and benefits to make the case for the long-term investment, funding that's needed. Fewer innovation projects, please, perhaps. More maintenance, as Cara kicked us off with this morning. So that's kind of where capability gap got to. Anyone in the session think I've missed anything important? You know, I thought about this for 30 seconds just before I started talking. So. Good. So let me ask. Now, Joël, I believe, is going to report back on policy management and ontology-supported preservation. Excellent. Yeah, come on down the front. Talk into the mic. I'm not going to make people sit in a panel up front because that's a bit strange, but come and be magnified. And 5-10 minutes, as much time as you think you have.
Okay.
All right.
So in our group, we did a brief introduction to some of the ontologies that are in the linked resource model and the digital ecosystem model, some of the domain-specific ontologies that have been developed as part of PERICLES. And then we presented some use cases from Archamatica, the software project that I work on, specifically around email preservation. And this was an attempt at what we described as, here are the policies that are being used in Archamatica now, and here's a set of policies that we may want to change to. And we talked about how you might model these kinds of policies and the impact of these on working systems, and how some of the conversation in the room was pretty interesting about how the ontologies that have been developed within PERICLES sort of help to expose how much of your preservation policies may be actually implicit as opposed to explicit. You may be doing things in code that you didn't really know you were doing. When you start modeling the policies, you can start to understand that you made decisions, or maybe a developer made the decision, or maybe someone else made the decision, but because you didn't have a way to really describe your policies in a formal way, you don't necessarily have a history or a record of what the decision was. Some of the feedback, I think, around looking at the policies, looking at the ontologies was that they look quite powerful. It's a little bit daunting to look at these big diagrams with all these different classes and entities. And we talked about how it may be possible to use this stuff in an incremental way. It's not necessary to model everything at once. It's something you could build over time. It's also quite likely that some of the ontologies are actually things that would be used by software developers rather than by people. That it may be, there are places, for example, within the Archimedica user interface where it makes sense to show, I have the user interface could be, populated from entities that were described as in these ontologies. It doesn't mean that the user of the software knows that there's ontologies in there. And I think that the purpose of that particular workshop was to kind of introduce at a theoretical level, describe the ontologies and describe the use cases, and then tomorrow in the session, in our follow-up session, we're going to actually take those email examples and show them as modeled as linked data, and then work in groups through working with them and extending those policies. So I don't know if anyone else who is there wants to add any comments. Otherwise, that was about it.
Sounds like a good advert for tomorrow's session. That sounds really interesting. I wish I could go to it. So there was a session on a risk assessment for preservation of the active life of complex digital objects. And Pip, I've got a report back. Sorry, I did make you get to that.
Okay, so I'm going to try and report back for our group. Our group was made up of Patricia Falcao, Barbara Reed, Tomasz Miksa, Simon Waddington, and Cara Van Molson. And I've kind of tried to distill our discussions. We had some presentations and then we broke into 3 groups. One looked at the synergies between software-based art and scientific experiments. One looked at records of risk in the current workplace. And one looked at risk and value assessments to support long-term planning. And so these are some points that I got, but hopefully others will chip in. There still seems to be questions about establishing the identity of various, now we don't want to use things or objects or maybe interconnected somethings that is the focus of our preservation efforts. But there's still the question of being clear about what it is we're trying to preserve. Interestingly, about half the group are actively involved in assessing risk of digital collections. There was an idea that risk assessment is fundamentally a communication and a prioritization tool. All domains are conducting risk assessments, but actually there still seems to be a lack of really talking to each other and looking at how these are working across the different domains. The exception is the work that Cara's been doing to look at ICROM's magnitude of risk, and also the work that Patricia Falcao did in her thesis looking at software-based art in 2010. We can assess risk at different levels. So we had that nice continuum model where we can go from object to collection to institution to society. And I guess one of the interesting things is to think about the different factors of analysis at those different levels. I think that was very helpful. One of the things we weren't sure about is whether we should strive for objectivity or accept informed subjectivity as a reality when managing this sort of complexity. However, we were all clear that we liked the idea of tools that would provide decision support. And Simon presented his data-driven approach, looking at activity on things like GitHub to give us indications of when certain types of software were going to become less current. This is a plug for his session tomorrow. He's got a session about his tool. There are unsolved problems. We picked up again on the idea of inherent vice that is engineered into our software and processes that we use standardly in our workplaces, particularly the problem of the use of links. There is common ground, we decided, between the challenge of replicating experiments in science and software-based art. And I think there's some really interest in identifying what's meant by verification and validation in both these contexts. And there's work there to be done to articulate that. And then finally, I think we'd agree that just because something has been made using ephemeral technology does not mean that society doesn't want to keep it. And a nice example was given as the Prime Minister, I guess this is in Australia because it came from Barbara Reid, discussing things on WhatsApp, that's a record that actually might have value, although it's treated as a very ephemeral platform. Anybody want to add anything? Who was in the session? No, all happy. Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Pip. And the fourth session was Pericles in Practice. Who would like to? Johannes, good man. Report back on that.
Yes, so the Pericles in Practice session was not a panel discussion, it was a demonstration of some of the Pericles tools which we have developed throughout the projects and the interplay of the tools. So we had two workflows we presented. So the first one was automatically populating populating information to the model. So for this reason, we used the ecosystem model as base. We just briefly presented the model. And then we created a template for populating the information. And then we used the Pericles extraction tool. It's a tool which can extract information throughout the runtime, for example, system usage, file information, and a lot of other things. And so we built a connection script to collect this information and populate this to the model, so to have a full ecosystem model with live data, because building model is hard, and a model is only useful if the information is updated, and it follows the model-driven preservation team from Pericles. So the first workflow populated the model and sent it to the model repository, and from this other Pericles tools can run on. So the first workflow stopped at sending it to the repository, and the second workflow had the aim to demonstrate how policies can be automatically applied. So both workflows had the space use case in background. So one, because Pericles has one of the art and media use case and the space use case. So for this, we used satellite data from the space and to do some tests with it. So the second workflow had a policy, had a digital ecosystem with a policy that says the data must be public if it's older than 24 hours. So we tried to use that simple policy to build a model, to include it into the model, and made the policy executable and into the model and use the tools. So for this reason, we also used again the ecosystem model to represent it. The model, and use the eco builder to create the model, but also connect it to the policy editor, so the policy editor can then edit the policy and then send it to the model store, and then later on the model is sent to the linked resource model service to calculate the difference. So what's the difference between the old version and the new version? So to see the impact of a change, basically. And so the end result was then that the policy has been changed and been executed. And so it showed how models can capture this information, and also how the models can also affect the real system, because at the end the policy has modified the data to make it public. So that was two demonstrations. And most of the tools we demonstrated here are open source and are available on the PERICLES GitHub page. So please check the PERICLES GitHub page, and also the two workflows are available there for review. Yep, that was basically it.
Thank you. Any
Yep.
questions? Okay, thank you. So, I don't propose I make you sit here for the next 25 minutes, but a couple of things struck me, possibly by construction in the agenda, but certainly by conclusion it seems from the sessions, that we all seem still to be wrestling with the complexity of digital preservation, perhaps even understanding what the problem really is. Am I right? Another way to put it is, a number of people, certainly in our session, commented that, and in the coffee afterwards, they went to similar conferences 2 years ago, 4 years ago. Are we making progress? Or are we not? Don't know. Any thoughts?
I think we are making progress, but I think
Good.
we're now worrying about things that we weren't worrying about 4 years ago because the world around us has changed. So I think we've made progress against the challenges we had then, and because the world is changing so fast, we're running to keep up. So I think there's also something about, from our keynote this morning, about the shiny and new versus the maintenance. And there's a bit of a danger of not recognising good when it's good enough, and wanting the best to be, and the best becoming the enemy of the good. Sorry, that's, yeah. So I think things are better than they were, but it doesn't feel like it, in summary.
That makes a lot of sense to me, for sure. I think we are perhaps addressing more complex problems than we were.
Hi, thanks. I've been involved in digital preservation for about 15 years, and I can tell you that 15 years ago we were saying the same things as were said this morning. So I think we actually have a problem.
That's my worry.
Because it seems to me that we either haven't got anywhere in 15 years or 20 years, or else we're redoing things that have already been done. And I think that's a problem. Whatever it is, if it's one of those two, it's a problem.
Comments from the audience?
I think we should recognise the scale of data production in every domain or vertical, whatever you call it, is massively, exponentially increased in that period though. So the scale and the nature of outputs is part of our cycle. And I think a problem you solve now is a new problem in 10 years because the scale increases massively and the complexity increases. I don't think that's a problem necessarily.
I think also the fact that preservation is not, let's say, a problem of an organization itself anymore. Actually, data span across multiple sites, so preservation must somehow be addressed by a network of organizations, so new challenges arise there. This is something else that we didn't deal in the past. I mean, we had to pose challenges, how to archive, how to preserve data within a central authority. Now, this is not occurring.
I think there's a lot of truth to the comments there. I think we have moved on because I think the problem is different. I think the problem may be changing continually, and that's giving us challenges. I think the pace of data generation, the pace of innovation of tooling to try and address sort of data escalation, both of those things I think are the enemy of stability and preservation, and we have a tension there which we're going to have to understand how to reconcile soon.
So as technology changes, we'll have new problems, and that's inevitable, but it also should be the fun part. But I do think that what we're hearing is that we're finally getting to a critical mass, towards a critical mass of organizations that are ready to go to upper levels of practice. And in some cases, we're hearing new voices. We went through a whole phase of inventing and reinventing the tools, because that's what happens at stage 2. And all of the things about how it's hard, and that's classic organizational maturity model. And now the only concern I have at the moment is that we will now start reinventing the organizational piece. We have the models, we just really need to get on with the hard work of building sustainable digital preservation programs, and understanding that when people get into it, it's impossible. It's like sending people to boot camp. It's hard. It's harder to be at stage 2 than it is to be at stage 4, because you have so much to do, and you're building infrastructure as you're trying to understand it.
What's stopping us?
I'll just add in then whoever, but the confidence, and that's very also classic at stage 2. People, if you were to talk to managers of photo collections and their height before we started to have to digitize them, they would have kicked anybody out of their room who tried to tell them what to do. We got to well beyond stage 4 with that. This is one example of curation and preservation. We have to get to the same point with digital preservation, so that people have the confidence to say, here's my program, this is what I'm doing, this is out of scope right now, I'm looking across, I'm collaborating, I'm doing due diligence. Who starts a project without doing a lit review? It's where we have to acknowledge the long tail, provide attribution to things, and say, we've been doing, this month, well, tomorrow officially, what marks 50 years since the electronic records program started at the National Archives in the US. And it's not alone in those long-standing things. Are we solving the same problems? Relatively speaking, yes. Specifically, no.
So someone said money, which for sure is an issue. We could talk about misaligned incentives perhaps, but.
So there's talk about digital preservation in cultural institutions at the point when records, objects are with the library or archives. But actually, digital preservation should be seen as something that you start, as it was, I believe, mentioned today as well. It starts at the point of creation. So I don't think it's the right way forward just to focus on creating models and programs, open source solutions. I think, and I know for a fact, there is a big gap in actually educating people who create. So it's about educating people working in our organizations, it's about educating researchers, because for a majority of people who work with big data, whenever it's mentioned, oh yes, we need to discuss digital preservation just so that we ensure data is accessible or records are accessible 5-10 years from now. And the answer is, well, we're just going to migrate to a newer version of the system and it will be fine. And we don't have to worry about storage space because we're just going to buy another box of the server space and we'll be perfectly fine. So what's the point of managing? What's the point of ensuring metadata? So having the conversations for lay people who wouldn't necessarily understand why we are here today, but some simple guidance for administrators, for researchers starting to build their data sets. Because if they apply good practice at the beginning, at the point of creation, the metadata, the links within the systems they create, then at the point when that information reaches archives, it will be actually much easier to preserve.
I would fully support this statement, and actually I think that community is already doing something in that direction, because we talk about curation, we talk about data stewardship, We talk about collaboration platforms where we create space for exchange of data, and we are trying to integrate tools that collect automatically stuff from these environments to provide better descriptions of the experiments of data collected and to make it easier for preservation. So I think that we have already this movement. I think we have competing teams that propose their solutions, and there is also a lot of politics involved, who is going to get credit for delivering a better standard, better solution. And maybe if we would be able to get away from this politics and then just agree on how we pick the best standard, which is really best for purpose and not best because somebody has a good name, then maybe it would all become easier. But I think we have data curation, data stewardship that is trying to help digital preservation with organizing the data.
I've got a question, a comment about the amount of research funding that goes into this area and relating that to the lack of progress over the last 15 years. Because I'm going to say something quite controversial in this community. If you ask people to go away for 4 years and think about things, they're going to go away for 4 years and think about things. And there's a lot of money spent on research, and there's a lot less money spent on practical implementations of real solutions. And that is, the research is starting to be the enemy of actually doing things. And I know a lot of the academics in this room are going to be looking daggers at me all evening, so I'm going to check my drinks. But I think it's a question worth asking. Should we be now moving on to just simple, practical solutions that are, as so many people have said, good enough, but don't, you know, there's further research to be done, but let's put the research down for a little bit and start building things.
The response at the back.
It's only to say that I don't always agree with John Tilbury, but on this occasion I absolutely agree with John Tilbury. As someone who has to deliver an operational system in a national archive, the problem I have is too much bloody research and not enough operational systems that I can go and get. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Surely somebody else wants to pick up on that. I can't disagree, actually. I think there is a gap, one of the many gaps, between doing the research, I mentioned this in the session, having a minimum viable product which somebody would be interested in investing in. That gap in the middle, how do you convert the research into something that someone would invest in? That's missing, I think. Pip?
I mean, I think one of the ways we could look at this is by actually refocusing what the research looks at. And I think what I was sort of trying to talk about this morning was the invisible mountain that happens before we get close to a system. And I still think that there's a huge amount of research that needs to happen there. And I think that the outcome that we're looking for is, you know, it was research that established that germs on doctors' hands were a bad idea and they should wash their hands. But then we've gone from that point to doctors washing hands, which was great progress, and now we've got a sort of operationalized system where you cannot walk into a hospital ward without going past one of those dispensers that will remove the bugs on your hands. And I think that we need to refocus the efforts into, as Cara was saying this morning, how do we operationalize some of these ideas? And I don't think that that is not research. I do think that that is research. But it's practice as research.
It's maybe more applied research. It's the next step, perhaps. Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
I totally agree with that last part. I think the last research agenda we had for digital preservation is more than 10 years ago, for the community-wide, is more than 10 years ago. People will get tired of hearing about maturity models, but everything we do, tools, people, programs, research, goes through maturity levels. And if we do stage 2 research, we end up with projects that are not sustainable and don't go into practice. But if we do strategic research, this is an applied field. It can't be research to know it, but it also can't be jump to development. We need to embrace research-based practice and do it in a systematic way, hopefully across the community, not only the EU or North America or, but really figure out how to do something like Interpares. That was a success that they totally had, was a global project.
Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts, grumbles? So apart from these things, everything's fine. Good. Let me ask you a question. I think it is the case that the incentives are misaligned, whether it's misalignment in market forces, in research policy, whatever. I don't think, and this is really the misalignment for me, is a lot of things are geared to invest in a project, to innovate, and what we do want is more of the boring stuff. It's more of the maintenance, etc. How can we make that shift? And if anyone can answer that just off the top of their head, then you get to be next director of research in the UK, I'd say. I mean, what are the issues? Is it cultural? I think partly. How do we do it? This is something I don't think we've made progress on for a long time.
I really like Kara's idea of using tools that are used in marketing to make a case. And isn't some of this fundamentally about making a case for budgets and job titles and resources and departments in organisations? And it's no good moaning and complaining and suffering. I think you have to learn to speak the language of budget holders and members of the exec or the board of governors. And once you can speak that language, and maybe using marketing colleagues to help you is a good idea. But I think it's no good to speak the language of archivists if you expect to secure budgets to build departments and teams. So I think get serious about speaking to budget holders and do it properly, seek help. Don't go into it like a hobby, and build a case, build departments and permanent jobs with job titles about digital preservation. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I think this is not a problem that's unique, and I think it's been pointed out, unique to digital preservation. The kind of thing that everybody wants to pay for the flashy new website, but nobody wants to maintain it as it slowly crumbles into some sort of weird mutant thing. So in a way, actually there could be a kind of common cause made with the IT developers, and this might be actually, this particular phase in technological development might be a time to make it while people are struggling with having to migrate data out of old systems, is to kind of embrace the idea of digital continuity, that you don't need to just think about the system now and what it does, but how easy it is for you to obtain that information out of that. Because the thing is, if we don't get involved in that kind of area and make those kind of alliances, other people will do that in a kind of more ham-fisted way. And it's been happening in our organisation, that other people have been coming across that and doing their own kind of thing.
And also maybe one or two final questions or points, and then we can get away a little bit early, which must be good. So, I mean, change is in many ways clearly the enemy. Do we fight it or do we embrace it? I think fighting is fairly pointless, for sure. There was a Danish king of England who illustrated that very effectively quite a long time ago. If there are no other questions, thoughts from the floor, I propose 5 to 5. We can call it a day. Thanks for attending. Thanks to all the speakers for today. And thanks for being an interactive audience. See you tomorrow, or this evening. Thank you.